Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack the macro-chronological epic of how the deadliest conflict in human history structurally began, escalated, and finally ended. We're looking at the entire course of World War II, spanning from the flawed Peace of Versailles right up to the dawn of the atomic age.
To keep things manageable, we've structured this massive 25-year history into 5 distinct chapters for you. The Tinderbox, Blitzkrieg and the Fall of Europe, a global war, the turning points, and finally, defeat and the atomic dawn.
All right, Act 1, the Tinderbox, covering 1919 to 1939. This entire period is basically defined by Marshal Ferdinand Foch's chillingly accurate prediction about the peace treaty ending the First World War. He called it a mere armistice for 20 years.
So, let's break down that treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, using a handy acronym, BRAT. Germany was forced to accept sole blame, they faced massive reparations, had their armed forces functionally dismantled, and lost a ton of territory, 13% of their European land to be exact. The German public didn't see this as a negotiation at all. To them, it was a diktat, a dictated peace, and that created a deep, structural resentment that Adolf Hitler would absolutely exploit later on.
Now that R in BRAT, the reparations, it was initially set to an astronomical figure, 6.6 billion pounds. Just a staggering number. Germany was barely keeping its head above water using American loans. But when the 1929 Wall Street crash happened, those loans vanished. The rug was pulled right out from under the fragile Weimar Republic, triggering hyperinflation, brutal austerity, and leaving 6 million people totally unemployed.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how directly that economic ruin translated into electoral success. Look at 1928. The Nazis were just a fringe party with 2.6% of the vote. But by 1932, amidst absolute economic desperation, they captured 37.3%. People had lost faith in democracy and turned to the extremes. And here's the crucial thing. Hitler didn't storm the capital with an army. He legally walked right through the front door because the system was already paralyzed, allowing him to rule by emergency decree under Article 48.
So while Hitler aggressively rebuilt Germany's military and tore up the Versailles Treaty, the international community just kinda faltered. The League of Nations proved to be structurally toothless, totally failing to stop these early aggressions. And this birthed the policy of appeasement, basically giving in to a dictator's demands in exchange for a promise of future peace. The absolute peak of this was the 1938 Munich Agreement, where Czechoslovakia's vital Sudetenland was just handed over to Hitler so Neville Chamberlain could famously declare, "Peace for our time."
But as you might guess, appeasement collapsed rapidly during the structural pivot of 1939. In March, Hitler broke his promises and occupied Prague. Britain finally realized deterrence was needed. But then came the shock of the century in August, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This Machiavellian deal secretly divided Poland and secured Hitler's eastern flank. With that massive insurance policy in place, Germany invaded Poland on September 1st. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. That 20-year armistice, it was officially over.
Moving into Act 2, Blitzkrieg and the Fall of Europe, 1939 to 1941. Following a brief period known as the Phoney War, the terrifying tactical efficiency of the Axis was fully unleashed.
Germany introduced a totally new doctrinal synthesis known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. It combined independent armored columns, the famous panzers, with close tactical air support from Stuka dive bombers, and it was all seamlessly coordinated by radio. This allowed them to move so much faster than Allied high command could even react. I mean, they bypassed France's massive Maginot Line entirely just by driving tanks straight through the Ardennes forest, a place the French mistakenly thought was literally impassable.
The sheer speed of this blitzkrieg actually trapped Allied forces right up against the sea. 330,000. That's the incredible scale of British and French troops that had to be evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk during Operation Dynamo in 1940. This makeshift fleet of military and civilian little ships managed to save the army, but shortly after, France surrendered. At that point, Britain stood completely alone, enduring the relentless terror bombing of the Blitz.
Let's move to Act 3 and see how this builds into a global war of annihilation spanning 1941 to 1942. This is where the conflict fundamentally scales up, expanding massively into the Soviet Union and all the way across the Pacific Ocean.
In June 1941, Hitler tore up his pact with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Then, on December 7th, Japan launched an unprovoked surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. This prompted President Roosevelt to famously declare it a date which will live in infamy. In a fatal miscalculation, Hitler then chose to declare war on the United States. And just like that, the conflict shifted from rapid tactical maneuvers into a brutal war of macroeconomic attrition against the combined massive industrial might of the US, the USSR, and Britain.
Behind the front lines in the East, the war revealed its darkest, most horrific reality. Now, in studying the Holocaust, historians often debate its evolution. You have intentionalists who argue Hitler had a clear day-one blueprint to exterminate the Jewish people. On the other hand, functionalists argue the final solution evolved more logistically during the war, as an improvisational response when the Russian invasion stalled out. But regardless of the spark, philosopher Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil really applies here. This was a highly organized, bureaucratic state enterprise dedicated to mass murder. Following the 1942 Wannsee Conference, the Nazi state officially coordinated this final solution using industrial technology. Extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau were built with a singular, horrific function in mind. The result of this was the systematic industrialized murder of 6 million Jewish people. That's 2/3 of Europe's entire Jewish population, alongside millions of Roma, disabled individuals, Soviet prisoners, and political dissidents. Which brings us to Act 4, the tide turns, from 1942 to 1944. By 1942, the Axis powers had pushed to their absolute territorial limits, and the industrial might of the Grand Alliance finally began to push back.
But before any land invasion could even be considered, we have to ask, how did the Allies defeat the U-boat threat in the Battle of the Atlantic? You see, this was the longest and arguably the most vital campaign of the entire war. Britain relied completely on sea imports just to survive and build up forces for an invasion. But German U-boat wolf packs were sinking thousands of supply ships. They were literally threatening to starve Britain out. While the Allies permanently turned the tide in the Atlantic by May 1943 using a specific technological triad. First, the convoy system, which grouped ships together with armed escorts. Second, the rapid development of sonar and radar to track submerged submarines. And third, ultra-intelligence. The brilliant codebreakers at Bletchley Park successfully decrypted the German naval Enigma cipher. This was a real game-changer, allowing them to route convoys safely away from the wolf packs.
And with those supply lines secure, victories on land started to follow. Down in North Africa, General Montgomery's forces defeated Erwin Rommel at El Alamein, successfully defending the absolutely vital Suez Canal. This pivotal moment prompted Winston Churchill to brilliantly observe, "Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning."
So the crucial point here is that these massive turning points didn't happen in isolation. They were a masterclass in strategic synchronicity. Over in the east, the brutal Soviet pincer movement at Stalingrad trapped the German Sixth Army in grueling Rattenkrieg, tying down massive Axis forces. At the same time, securing the Atlantic allowed millions of American troops to cross the ocean safely. All of this structurally culminated in D-Day in June 1944. That's when Operation Overlord, backed by a massive deception campaign called Fortitude, finally breached the Atlantic Wall, forcing Germany into a doomed two-front war.
Now we enter Act 5, Defeat and Atomic Dawn, 1945. These are the harrowing final months that saw the collapse of the fascist regimes and permanently redrew the map of the world.
Even before Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender on VE Day, the Big Three met at the Yalta Conference. And what's wild is that what they designed as a framework for peace actually became the blueprint for the Cold War. They divided Germany and Berlin up into occupation zones, they formed the United Nations, but Stalin, despite promising free elections, systematically created a communist buffer zone across Eastern Europe. Those lines drawn at Yalta, they very quickly solidified into the physical borders of the Iron Curtain.
And while Europe was celebrating peace, the Pacific War raged right on. The U.S. was pursuing a brutal strategy of island hopping straight toward the Japanese mainland. The fighting there was characterized by just fanatical resistance, including kamikaze suicide attacks. Observing this, U.S. military planners were terrified that a full-scale land invasion of Japan could result in up to 1 million American casualties. Seeking a way to end the war immediately, President Truman turned to the top-secret Manhattan Project.
On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped a little boy atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly vaporizing 70,000 people. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. Facing this, Japan surrendered unconditionally on August 15th, known as VJ Day. The atomic bomb held a really stark dual reality. Yes, it achieved the military goal of avoiding a bloody land invasion, but it was also an unprecedented display of American destructive supremacy. It effectively served as a massive geopolitical warning aimed squarely at the Soviet Union.
Which leaves us with this provocative thought to consider. Did World War II truly end in 1945, or did it simply trade the battlefields of Europe for the geopolitical shadows of the Cold War? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I invite you to explore how this atomic dawn shaped the post-war world next.